Hey everybody, thanks so much for joining us here today for Captain Kimo's HDR Technique Revealed, presented by Kim Seng, aka Captain Kimo from CaptainKimo.com. Before we take a look at some of this amazing imagery, I do want to let you know that this is a co-sponsored webinar, co-sponsored by Topaz Labs and HDR Soft, the creators of Photomatix Pro. And if you're interested, just know that both are free trials and you can just download them from the company sites. So with that, let's go ahead and take a look at some of this amazing imagery of Mr. Captain Kimo's while I tell you a little bit about him, and then I will turn it over to him to tell you a bit more. So again, he is going to be going over his full HDR technique that's going to include Photomatix, Topaz plugins. It's also going to include several other programs such as Lightroom and Photoshop Elements. So he's going to have a wide range of stuff he's covering, and I think it'll be a really good tutorial here today. So Kim Seng, better known as Captain Kimo from CaptainKimo.com, is a photo blogger whose main focus is Florida wildlife and landscape photographs. His expertise is in the field of high dynamic range photography. All of Kim's photos here that you're looking at have been captured and processed using high dynamic range techniques for more color, contrast, and detail. His photos, as you may have guessed, have been published and exhibited in several publications, exhibitions, and galleries. And Kim teaches photography and trains people how to use photography software. His experience goes way beyond just the camera and definitely extends into software. He has over a decade of professional experience using Photoshop and other graphic programs, so he's an excellent teacher to learn these types of techniques from, and I'm super excited about it. Let's see here, his professional work history is pretty extensive as well. It includes commercial art, graphic design, web development, and art direction. So with that, thank you so much for coming today, and I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Mr. Captain Kimo.
Well, thank you, Nicole. I am so excited to be here. I wanted to thank the audience for making time to attend this webinar. I've always wanted to do a webinar, but I just haven't had the time to do one, so when you emailed me about it to do one for Topaz, I was astounded. So let's get started. I have a lot to cover, so let's start with what HDR photography stands for. And HDR photography stands for high dynamic range. And what high dynamic range photography is all about is capturing more light, because high dynamic range, the simple definition of high dynamic range, is to be able to get more of something. So high dynamic range in photography is more about light and capturing more of the image, the detail, the color, and the contrast. So the photo I have up right now was taken at the beach during a sunrise, and this is one of my favorite photos. I like to show people who are new to HDR what HDR is. And this is a standard photo that you would normally take if you were at the beach shooting a sunrise. This is a standard evenly exposed image. You can see that with this image that the highlights here are completely blown out. There's no definition in the clouds because it's just washed out because the light here is so intense. Also around the shadow area right around here, you don't have any detail and it's all gone. It's almost completely black in some areas. And HDR photography will basically solve this problem. And how we do that is by taking multiple exposures. So if I wanted to take another photo to compensate for the blown out sky, I would take a exposure which is 2 stops under. And this will fill in the color in the sky here and give us some nice definition in the clouds. However, this will even darken our foreground even more, so what we'll need to do is take another set of another exposure, and that exposure will be 2 stops up. And this exposure will fill in the detail in the shadow areas here in the rock. So what we will do is we will take all 3 exposures. This is the even exposure. This is the underexposure. We're using this for the color and the clouds. And this is the overexposure, which is being used for the foreground. We take those 3 exposures and we merge them into an HDR program. Now I use Photomatix, but there are plenty of other HDR programs. I recommend Photomatix. and we will get this one image. Now this one image has all the details and all the colors from those 3 exposures. Now I know a lot of you have probably heard about HDR photography before and have seen some of the other photos that have given you a bad taste for HDR images, and this is probably something resembling those images. Now when we do HDR, you have the option to go very crazy on your photo, or you can just do something very realistic. So it really is up to the photographer to get what they want out of their HDR photographs. Alright, so now that I've covered what HDR photography is, let's talk more about my HDR workflow. So to start, let's start with Picasa. Now this is Picasa, and I use Picasa for my photo album. This is where I store all my images, and where I preview and locate my photos when I need them. Next, I used Photomatix. This is Photomatix here. I use Photomatix to create my HDR photos. And once I create my HDR photos, I go into Photoshop Elements, and this is where I post-process, I clean up my image, and where I use Topaz plugins to enhance my HDR photos. Next, once I'm done enhancing my photos, I go into Lightroom, and this is where I finish my photos off by toning it, by adding a little more color and a little more detail. Okay, so let's go back to Picasa to take a look at the photos that we'll be working on. These photos right here are the 4 exposures that we'll be using for the tutorial, and I took this specifically because I wanted to show people how I shoot waves. Now I'm known for shooting really cool waves of the ocean during sunrise, so we'll start with 3 exposures that I shot for HDR. This is the evenly exposed image, this is the underexposed image, and this is the overexposed image. Now the 4th exposure, I shot this exposure just for the wave, and this exposure is shot at 1/5 of a second. Now I use shutter speed priority for this shot, and I might have shot half a dozen photos before I got this one that I liked. And once I got this one exposure that I liked, I shot the 3 exposures here for HDR. Now sometimes I shoot the 3 exposures first just so I don't forget for the HDR image. But this is how I shoot my waves. And what I do is I will take the 4 exposures, I'll select them in Picasa, and I will open Photomatix, and I will just simply drag and drop it into the Photomatix window. Hit OK here and OK here, and we will get a pre-processing option. Now I'm not going to cover this entirely, I'm just going to go over really fast. Align source images is for when you are hand holding your HDR, or when you're hand holding your camera to shoot HDR. You want to check this. If you're not hand holding, I would recommend checking it off. Remove ghost, this I will check, and this is how we will select that one particular wave. And I'm going to cover ghosting in a second here. Let me go over this. Reduce noise, I'll check that off. I normally have reduce noise on, but I'll check that off for this tutorial so that it will go faster. The same thing with reduce chromatic aberration, I'll check that off. I like using it because it does help a lot. So remove ghosting, this is a topic that comes up when we talk about HDR. And the reason is when you're taking 3 exposure, especially of a moving object, those, or the object itself, will be in different spots. So I'm gonna open another set of exposures. Okay, so here is another set of exposures. I didn't want to use the wave photo because it'll be hard to kind of tell what I'm talking about with this set though. This set is shot with a moving train. Now I took 3 exposures here. This is the even exposure, and this is the underexposure, and this is the overexposure. Now notice the train is moving and they're in different spots in each exposure. And when we take it into Photomatix and merge it together without any ghosting option, we will get a train that's in different position, almost faded. You can see it slightly faded in here, and that's where the term ghosting comes from. So if we were to go into Photomatix and select the ghosting option, we will get the train in a specific spot, and I'll show you how to manually do that. If you wanted to let Photomatix do it automatically, it can also do that, and it does a pretty good job. So let's go ahead and go back and I'll show you how to do that, remove the ghosting in Photomatix. Okay, so we are back in Photomatix and we have removed ghost check with selective deghosting on, and we will click OK. Now in a few seconds here we will get a window where we can select the area of the wave that we want for our HDR image. So this is the selective deghosting window, and to select the area of the wave that we want to left click and drag around the ocean and make our selection. Once we make our selection, we want to right click and make the selection as a ghosted area. Click on that. Once we have that selected, we want to right click and then select our exposures. Now there's 4 exposures here. We just want the one with the wave, so I'm going to select that. And to preview that area, we can hit the preview deghosting button here, and it will show you what it's going to use for the HDR photo. So I'm going to go back here and I'm going to select this area here and make some selection around these clouds over here, because these clouds are moving and I want to just use one exposure for that particular area. And that's good. Let me just check to make sure it is using the exposure that I want, and it is. So we'll go ahead and hit the OK button and let Photomatix process the photo. And we're going to end up in the tone mapping window here shortly, and we'll have 3 options to create our HDR photo. And when that window pops up, I'll show you what those 3 options are. Okay, so here is our tone mapping window, and we have 3 options to tone map. If you go over here top left hand side, you'll see tone mapping. Under tone mapping you have detail enhancer or tone compressor. Now detail enhancer will give us better detail, and let me bring up a better preset here for enhancer that will show us what detail enhancer can do, and this is pretty much what detail enhancer can do. Now if we were to go into tone compressor over here, it will give us better colors and better tones. And here is one of my favorite presets for tone compressor is deep, and it gives the HDR image a very rich deep color. The only problem is it doesn't really give a lot of detail. The third option for creating our HDR photo is exposure fusion. If you click on that, exposure fusion will generate a more realistic HDR image. Now I'll admit I don't really use exposure fusion as much as other photographers. That's because my style caters more towards detail enhancer. So that's what we're going to use is detail enhancer. So I'm going to go back to tone mapping and select detail enhancer for my HDR image. And I have a preset already set for this particular photo, and we're going to go ahead and select that preset. So now this is the HDR photo that we'll be using for our tutorial. Now I'm not going to cover any of the sliders here. I'm just going to process the image. If you want to learn more about these sliders in detail, I cover tone mapping, tone compressor, and exposure fusion in 3 videos that I've created on my website at CaptainKimo.com. You can go over there and browse the video section. You'll find 3 videos specifically for each one. So I'm going to go ahead and hit process so that Photomatix will process the HDR photo. Alright, so here is our HDR photo that's been processed in Photomatix. Now I'm going to go ahead and save this, and I have it set up to save in the same directory so I never have to browse anywhere or find a folder to save it in. It always saves in the directory that the image was from. Now that that is saved, we can move on to Photoshop, but before we do, I wanted to cover shooting JPEG versus RAW. When you're doing HDR, you will always want to shoot RAW files because you will get such a better HDR image from RAW than you will in JPEG. Now, I've accidentally shot a set of HDR images in JPEG and I processed them unknowingly, and I realized later that I shot in JPEG and I was wondering why the image wasn't getting the detail and the colors that I was normally used to getting. And I've done it a couple of times when I've processed JPEG files and the colors and the details never come out like they normally do. So I always recommend shooting RAW when you shoot HDR images. So now that I've covered RAW versus JPEG, let's go ahead and move on to Photoshop. Okay, so we are back in Picasa right now, and here is our tone map image from Photomatix. It got saved automatically and Picasa picked it up and put it in the album. So what I'm going to do is right click here and open with Photoshop Elements, and it's going to launch in Photoshop, and now I can begin post-processing my photo. The first thing I'm going to do is denoise my photo, and I am going to do that by duplicating the background layer first. Now, I always create a new layer when I'm ready to do something to the image, so that I always leave the image before it intact. So what I do is I duplicate the layer. That's Command J on a PC, or Control J on a PC, and Command J on a Mac. So once I duplicate the layer, I will go into Filter to Topaz Denoise so that I can remove noise from the image. The preset that I will be using here is just JPEG Strong. I will click on that and you can see it removed a lot of the noise from the HDR photo. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And the reason I like reducing noise first in my photo is that when you do that first, you get a better result than if you were to do it later. If you did it later after you've manipulated the pixels, you don't get a good result as you would doing it at the beginning, because the pixels are altered, making it harder for any denoising program to reduce the noise. Okay, so now that Topaz Denoise has been applied to the HDR image, we're going to go and duplicate that layer again. So we're going to duplicate the layer that has been denoised, so that we will go into filters and apply Topaz Adjust to our photo. Now, Topaz Adjust has some pretty cool presets, and I'm just going to use Brilliant Warm for this particular photo. And click on that, and it adds just a little bit of a pop to the image. It enhances the photo by adding some contrast and some color to it. So I'm going to use that preset and click OK. So now it's applied Topaz Adjust, so I will do a before and after Topaz Adjust real fast so you can see the difference here. That's before and that is after. So now that we've done that, we're going to go ahead and apply Topaz Detail to the photo. So I'm going to duplicate the Topaz Adjust layer, and we're going to go into the filters again and go into Topaz Detail. So now I am going to click on the Micro Contrast Enhancement preset here, and what that does is gives the photo a little bit of detail in the foreground here, and that's what we want. It applied detail in the sky and we don't want that, so I'm going to click OK. And when we get back into Photoshop Elements, we're going to mask out this portion of the image. So I'm going to add a layer mask here. So after we have our layer mask here, we're going to go use the paintbrush tool. Make sure the color is black at 100%, and just be sure the layer mask is selected, and then start painting on top of the layer. And what this will do is remove the effect from Topaz Detail off of the image. And we will zoom in here. Let's go ahead and zoom in on the rocks here, and if I click on the eyeball over here, we will see that Topaz Detail did add some detail in the foreground of the rock. But if I zoom up here into the sky and I took off the eyeball, you can see that because of the mask, it is not affecting any of the clouds. So we're going to zoom out, and now that looks good. Next, what I'm going to do is I am going to create a composite layer, and I do this by clicking Control Alt Shift E on a PC. It's Command Alt Shift E on a Mac click on the topmost layer and click those 4 buttons, and what this does is this takes all the layers below it and creates a composite layer on top. Now once I have the composite layer on top here, I am going to go into filter and go into Topaz lens effect, and I am going to apply what is called an Orton effect to the image. And if you've ever seen a 3D movie, it looks very dreamy like, and this is what we're going to try to achieve from this image. And we do this by blurring the image. So I use the bokeh here for the SLR using from the lens effect preset, and the first preset here, Canon 135 f2, seems to work pretty good with this effect. Once I have that selected, I will click OK, and Topaz lens effect will blur the image. We don't want the blurred image, but we're going to use it for the Orton effect. So I am going to change the transparency mode here to soft light, and what you get here is a very dreamy like image. Of course, I don't want it this intense, so I am going to pull it back, or pull back the opacity, and I usually like my opacity around 30 to 40% for this particular effect. And if you want to learn more about the Orton effect, you can Google it, and I believe Wiki has some definition on it, and it's a pretty cool read, so I would suggest looking that up. Alright, so we are almost done. The last thing I'm going to do is create another composite layer that is Command-Alt-Shift-E, and it will take all the layers below it and create another layer on top. And I'm doing this now because I am going to clean the image a little bit. You can see there's some dust spots here. You can't really see it so well, so I have a trick here. I will use my levels layer to create a very high contrast so that you can see it now, some spots or dust spots on the sensor. And once I have that, I will click on the top layer again so that I will use the heal tool, and we're going to zoom in here. And we will use the spot healing tool to start removing all the little dust spots. And I'm not going to remove everything. I'm just going to remove some of the obvious ones and leave the other smaller ones alone, so you kind of get the idea of this process that I do to remove my dust spots, this little trick I have here to see them, because sometimes it's kind of hard to see these little dust spots, and then you don't notice them until you go process it later too intensely. There's one right here, and I think that's it. I'll just leave it right there at that. So once I'm done, I will just delete this layer here, this levels layer, because we just did that so that we can see the dust spots a little better. Now that I'm done with Photoshop Elements, I'm going to save it, and this will save I'm going to save it as a PSD file, and this will save my image back into that same directory. So now I will close out Photoshop and go straight into Picasa, and when I get back into Picasa, I will have my Photoshop file here loaded in Picasa. Again, Picasa has picked up the photo so I can edit it in Lightroom. So next I will right click in Picasa, and I will open with in Lightroom, and I will import it into Lightroom's library. Now once I get into Lightroom here, give it a second to load, I will click the import button, and then we will go into the develop module up here, select the photo, and I'm going to close out some of this window to get it a little bigger so we have a better view. So now we are in Lightroom, and I can start doing my color, contrast, tones, and detail in Lightroom. Of course, I'm going to straighten it out too. In fact, that's going to be the first thing that we're going to do, is straighten out the horizon. So for all of you who have been wondering if I was ever going to straighten out the horizon, now I will. So let's go ahead and just get those 2 points aligned, and that looks good, and I'm going to hit done there. Let me close this out real fast so we can start now working straight down the line here in Lightroom. And I am going to start with the temperature. I want this image to be a little warmer, so I'm going to play with it so to get it just a little warmer in my eyes. Exposure I am not going to touch with this particular photo, but I will bring up recovery light, and what this does is bring out the colors in the sky. So I will bring up the recovery, and then I will go into fill to just pull out some detail in some of the shadows. Black and brightness I usually leave alone, but I will adjust contrast, and that kind of almost brings up both the black and the brightness, so we will adjust that. And clarity, I always add some clarity to my photo in Lightroom. Vibrance, I do the same with vibrance. I add some vibrance to the image. Saturation, I usually always leave alone. I will bring my vibrance up, but usually I'll leave saturation alone unless I really need to bring up the colors, which for this image I won't. So I'm going to close basics, and we will move into the tone curves. Now I like to bring up most of the sliders here, highlights, lights, and darks, and this brings out a lot of the detail in the image, so I like to bring those up. So I'm done there. I'll close that out, and we will go into hue, saturation, and luminescence. With this particular photo, like I said, I wanted it a little warmer, so I will bring up all the warm colors in the saturation. So I will go into saturation and bring up the orange, bring up the yellow, and maybe the red. Yep, bring up the red a little bit, and I will bring up the blue to get the blues up here a little more saturated. And that looks really good. With luminescence, we will leave that alone. Usually I will adjust it, but this image is looking pretty good, so I will close that out, and we will go into split toning. And I really like using split toning to add mood to my images. And like I said, I like it warmer, so I will click on the highlights and bring some warm tones into the image. Now I will scroll around the color wheel here until I get a tone that I like, and I like it right about there, so I will close that out. And then I will go into the shadows and give it kind of a cooler tone. This is just for the shadows, so I will play around with a certain, until I get a certain color that I like for this particular photo. And I kind of like it right about there. And I'll close that out, and then I'll play with the balance to balance out the warm and cool tones to get this image just right. And that looks very good. So I'm going to close this out and then go into detail. Detail will be second to last thing here in Lightroom. And I will zoom into the rocks here just so that I will sharpen it up and just make the image a little crisp. So that looks good. We won't reduce any noise since we did that already in Photoshop using Topaz denoise. And that looks pretty good. So I'm going to close a detail out, and the last thing here is effects. I'm going to add a little post-crop vignetting to the photo. So I'm going to bring this up just so that around the whole image it darkens it up and draws the eye right into the photo. And maybe play with the feather or the density of the transition of the vignette. So that looks pretty good right there. And we're done. We're done in Lightroom, and that's the photo. So let's see a little quick before and after. That is before without Lightroom. This is just the enhanced Photoshop version of our HDR image, and this is the Lightroom version. So it looks pretty amazing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to export this using a preset that I made here for this webinar. And what this does is this will bring it into Picasa, and I will quickly go over what we just did. So let me go back to Picasa. Let's go back to the library here, and you can see here is our final HDR image in Picasa. So let's go back to the beginning here. Here is our 3 exposure for HDR. This is the evenly exposed image. This is the underexposed image. And this is the overexposed image. And we took those 3 photos, combined it with a 4th photo, and this photo was shot for the wave. We put those 4 photos together in Photomatix to get a nice HDR image. And then we took that image and took it into Photoshop to enhance it using Topaz plugins. And then we took it into Lightroom to make a beautiful HDR photo with some nice colors and some nice mood. So that's it. That covers my entire HDR workflow. I hope you got something out of it.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and take the screen back. I want to thank you again, Captain Kimo. I appreciate you sharing your technique with us.
Oh, thank you. I want to thank everyone for coming.
So have a great day, everybody, and thanks again for joining us.